The Sarenti were young. They knew this not from vanity or modesty, but from calculation. Their astronomical chronologies had taught them to distrust any measure born of pride. Their star was young beside the ancient bonfires, burning at the galaxy's edges. Their world had risen out of geological fire when other systems had already cooled into stillness. Their species had been questioning the sky with something more precise than superstition for only a few thousand years. To the universe, the Sarenti had only just opened their eyes, and yet, from the perspective of anyone less patient than the cosmos, they had come far. They lived on a clean, broad, carefully administered world, divided into 41 regions that were not countries, although some still carried the emotional weight of having been so. Each region chose its own representatives, settled its nearby concerns, tended its cities, its inland seas, its wind reserves, and its cultivated plains. But common laws, the truly consequential decisions, those capable of changing the course of all their lives, were debated in a global parliament built not to command from above, but to remind them that no region should ever again mistake itself for the center of history. The Sarenti liked to say they had no capital. They had research centers, orbital ports, memory archives, public amphitheaters, cities suspended on magnetic platforms, and entire valleys devoted to the cultivation of living crystal. But no capital, no single place should learn to think for everyone. From space, their planet shone with deliberate restraint. No crowns of pollution hovered above its cities. No oceans had been turned into luminous dumps. Heavy industry had long ago been moved to the inner planet, a dry, scorched sphere where nothing lived except machines. There, autonomous swarms received minerals, gases, and compounds brought in from asteroids, frozen moons, and the upper atmosphere of the nearest gas giant. Gravitational disks, vast as city squares, opened brief tunnels in the local geometry of space and pushed through them rivers of hydrogen, powdered metals, and blocks of ammoniacal ice. Raw matter traveled without ceremony. Finished goods returned with an almost domestic precision. 2 distribution bases orbited the Sarenti world like artificial moons. They belonged to no company, no region, no lineage. Any manufacturer, artist, laboratory, or citizen could send creations there. The bases cataloged, stored, and distributed them within minutes by cargo drones that descended over the cities like disciplined rain. A musical instrument made on the southern plateaus could reach, before nightfall, a child living beneath the polar auroras. A medical replacement designed by a coastal university could be printed in orbit and land beside a rural clinic before the patient had finished sleeping. Light was another substance the Sarenti had learned to domesticate. They bent it to build unsupported screens, compressed it into beams of communication, used it to raise 3-dimensional maps of solar storms, and to wrap their vessels in navigation veils. They could cross their system in days. They had not yet reached the speeds their equations promised, but they had made the internal distances of their home stop feeling like abysses. Their mining probes slept on comets. Their laboratories orbited nameless moons. Their telescopes, extended in silent swarms, looked beyond the outer cloud toward the thicket of blue stars surrounding their birthplace. They lived in a beautiful system. For them, that beauty was not a metaphor. Their sun burned inside a region populated by bright, young, violent stars, blue stars that tinted clear nights with a distant brightness. In certain seasons, when the atmosphere was clean and the cities dimmed their lights by custom, the sky seemed less like a vault than a depth illuminated from within. So many stars were visible that children first learned to distinguish the dark zones before they learned the constellations. Perhaps that was why the Sarenti had grown up convinced they could not be alone. It was not a simple scientific hypothesis. It was a collective inclination, a form of tenderness directed toward the unknown. For almost 3 centuries, the search for other intelligences had occupied a central place in their culture. There were institutes, observatories, and educational programs devoted to it, but also popular songs, childhood games, family debates, and public ceremonies. No one found it strange that an elder might spend their final years reviewing radio signals captured by community antennas, or that a group of adolescents might dedicate their holidays to designing mathematical greetings for hypothetical species with impossible senses. Every winter they celebrated Friendship Day. In all 41 regions, the plazas filled before dawn. People carried pulse lamps, small spheres that emitted a simple signal. Light silence, light silence. A greeting reduced to its skeleton. For weeks, schools, workshops, and universities prepared ceremonial microprobes, not always useful, not always destined to travel far, but all built with the same intention, to say someone was here who wanted to be found. The true probes departed from orbital facilities. 41 each year, one per region, launched toward directions carefully chosen so they would not repeat old hopes. In their silicon disks, they carried maps, mathematical sequences, chemical spectra, images of the planet, Sarenti anatomies, music, laughter, records of rain, instructions for answering, and an immense number of greetings. Some scientists considered that insistence redundant. Others defended it with fervor. No civilization, they said, could be certain which part of itself might be comprehensible to another. Perhaps an equation, perhaps an image, perhaps only the pause between two pulses. Dr. Tail never missed the launch, not because she was sentimental, although she was more so than she admitted, but because her work began where the celebration ended. She led the analysis team at the Institute of Frontier Sciences, an organization built along a strip of dark cliffs facing the equatorial sea. From a distance, the institute looked like another geological formation. Terraces of mineral glass, low towers covered in sensors, antennas folded like metal leaves, and a ring of underground laboratories descending into stable layers of ancient rock. The building had been designed not to dominate the landscape. That was a Sarenti obsession. That even science should remember it did not stand above the world it studied. The main corridors opened onto courtyards where pale-barked trees grew. The roof of the signal hall became transparent at night, and the researchers worked beneath a real sky, not a simulated one. In winter, when the blue stars rose over the ocean, the monitors looked less luminous than the universe they were trying to hear. Tail had spent half her life there. She was tall by the standards of her region, with measured movements and a calm voice. Her skin had the pearl-gray tone common among inhabitants of the equatorial coasts, and her large, dark eyes seemed more attentive to silence than to speech. She was not a public figure by desire. She had appeared often in educational transmissions, explaining why a repeated signal was not necessarily a message, or why a statistical alignment could look miraculous without meaning anything. People trusted her precisely because she did not promise wonders. Her specialty was methodical disappointment. Every day, the Institute received absurd amounts of information: radio pulses from active stars, flashes from distant magnetospheres, patterns produced by charged dust, echoes of their own transmissions bouncing off invisible objects, interference from mining probes, sensor errors, noise, and more noise. Tail's team filtered, compared, discarded. They searched for structure where there was almost always only chance. They searched for intention in a universe that produced imitations of intention with a cruel ease. Once, years before, a sequence of pulses from a dwarf star had paralyzed the Institute for 12 hours. The sequence seemed to obey a simple mathematical progression. There had been tears, embraces, trembling hands. Then they discovered that a defective gravitational sail, abandoned by a mining mission, was modulating background radiation as it spun on its axis. Tail was the one who announced the error. Since then, some had called her the guardian of the threshold. She let no hope pass unless it could stand upright. The nickname made her uncomfortable. She did not consider herself guardian of anything. She only knew that a civilization desperate to find company could begin hearing voices in the static. That morning, Tail arrived at the Institute before sunrise. The tide was low and the air smelled of metallic salt. On the horizon, the first orbital freighters descended as white points toward the transfer platforms. Higher above, nearly invisible, the distribution bases crossed the sky with majestic slowness. Tail stopped for a moment on the exterior bridge, placed one hand on the warm railing, and watched night withdraw from the sea. Above the line of dawn, stars belonging to the ancient stream of Progenitor B One of the two galaxies whose merger had shaped the Sarenti sky still glittered faintly through atmospheric turbulence. They were not special stars to most people. For astronomers, however, their position served as a reference for studying the deep currents of the merged galaxy, remnants of two great structures that, billions of years earlier, had ceased to be separate. Students learned those names as they learned any others. Progenitor B, the mingled arms, the old halos, the routes of fossil dust. No one pronounced them with mystery. They were geography. At the entrance to the institute, a memory wall displayed the Friendship Day launches of the last 287 years. Each probe appeared as a point, and each point left a faint line toward the exterior of the system. Most were still traveling. Some had stopped transmitting decades earlier. Others continued to send weak pulses, automatic reports on temperature, impacts, orientation, plate condition, and the wear of their casings. Tail knew that, given enough time, even the best protections surrendered. Space was not empty. It was a brace of patience. She entered the analysis hall as the night shift prepared to hand over. Workstations formed concentric circles around a holographic table where the living map of the system floated. Orbits, traffic routes, dust fields, probe positions, artificial gravitational currents, everything appeared in translucent layers that could be separated with a gesture. At the center, the sun burned, reduced to a sphere of golden light. "No candidates," said Irema, one of the night analysts, before Tail asked. "That sounds like a quiet night." Quiet in the offensive sense. 3 false modulations, 2 echoes from our own beacons, and an argument with the Polar Observatory because they insist their local noise has a personality. Tail left her bag beside the console and reviewed the reports. Nothing survived the first filter, nothing worth waking the committee for. Nothing that required anyone to hold their breath. There was an unwritten rule in the Institute. No one said maybe today. The phrase carried too much pressure. The Sarenti had waited for generations. They could wait one more morning without turning it into a promise. At midday, Tail attended a meeting with representatives from 3 regions who wanted to fund a new language of contact based on comparative atmospheric chemistry. The proposal was elegant and a little naive. It assumed any technological species would have studied its own sky with the same devotion as the Sarenti. Tail did not put it that way. She suggested expanding the model to include subterranean or oceanic intelligences, or intelligences that had developed on moons without a stable atmosphere. The representatives took enthusiastic notes. The Sarenti liked to correct a hope without killing it. Afterward, she visited the reception laboratory, a sealed chamber prepared for objects of unknown origin. It was almost never used. It had been built from a mixture of scientific rigor and civilizational fantasy. Multi-layer containment walls, nanometric manipulation arms, spectrometers, biological quarantine, electromagnetic isolation, particle deceleration fields, passive and active communication protocols. On one wall, engraved in 41 regional writing systems, was a ceremonial phrase. To receive is also a way of answering. Tail read it each time with a different unease. She found it beautiful. She also found it dangerous. To receive meant opening a door, and every door retained the memory of walls. As evening fell, the Institute reduced its activity. The interior lights dimmed so as not to compete with the sky. In the cities, millions returned home, checked the news, argued about regional politics, ordered food from the orbital bases, helped their children with stellar geometry. In the central parks, the monuments of memory began to catch the last sun. Enormous pillars covered in small transparent spheres that captured the light and returned it as a still white fire. No one passed them noisily. The Sarenti loved the future. But they did not allow themselves to forget what lay underneath. Tail watched one of those monuments from the Institute terrace. It was far away across the bay, barely visible among low buildings and vertical gardens. From that distance it looked like a needle of crystal. She knew that up close its surface was not uniform. Some spheres had a different opacity, like scars inside the shine. As a child she had asked why. Her mother had answered with a softness that concealed nothing, because not everything we lost could be recovered. That sentence, Tail thought, explained her people too well. Perhaps that was why they called. Perhaps that was why they sent probes, pulses, maps, greetings, and music into the dark. They did not only want to find others. They wanted others to find them before time reduced them to nameless remnants. They wanted to believe a voice could cross distance without becoming dust. They wanted the universe to have memory. The alert came shortly after nightfall. It was not a shrill alarm. The Institute of Frontier Sciences did not use dramatic sounds for events it did not yet understand. A discreet amber line appeared on the central console, almost shy. Then another. Then the system map reconfigured, drawing back until it showed the outer region, beyond the mining routes, beyond the navigation beacons, at the edge where the sun's gravity began to blur into the tide of other stars. An object had crossed the surveillance limit, small, cold, slow in interstellar terms, too fast to belong to an ordinary orbit. Its trajectory matched no registered comet, no Sarenti probe, no lost industrial fragment. The first sensors classified it as a wandering microasteroid, a broad and boring category that usually closed most incidents before anyone had time to get excited. Tail enlarged the spectroscopic reading. For several seconds, no one spoke. There was titanium, not in some ordinary mineral proportion, not naturally mixed with silicates and ice, but in a clean, processed signature, eroded by an extraordinarily long exposure. There were traces of aluminum. There were degraded compounds that suggested assembly, not accretion, and there was lead, a tiny and bewildering presence, trapped in a container, or in what had once been a container. Irema, who had stayed beyond her shift, stepped closer without taking her eyes from the screen. Could it be ours? Tail did not answer at once. She checked the trajectory, the inclination, the speed, the entry plane. The object came from an uncomfortable direction, ancient on the maps, associated with regions of the sky astronomers used when speaking of the galaxy before it had become one thing. That meant nothing by itself. Trajectories deceived. Stars moved. Everything moved. But the titanium was still there. "I don't know," she said at last. And that was the most honest, most terrible, and most beautiful sentence she could have spoken. In the minutes that followed, the Institute woke completely. Astrophysicists, materials engineers, specialists in interstellar objects, contact linguists, members of the scientific committee, and representatives of the global parliament were called in. An autonomous collector vessel, working in a cloud of frozen fragments several light hours away, received a new route. It would have to intercept the object, match its speed, examine it without touching it, and, if the protocols allowed, bring it home. Before docking, the ship would broadcast greetings, mathematical, chemical, visual, simple pulses, sequences of respect. Signals designed to say we are not a threat even to intelligences that might not understand the concept of threat. It was absurd to send greetings to a rock. It was more absurd not to. Tail authorized the full package. On the holographic table, the unknown point barely advanced, lost in the immensity of the outer edge. It did not shine. It did not answer. It did nothing that could be called intentional. And still, everyone in the room watched it as if it had just opened its eyes. Outside, the blue stars burned over the ocean. For the first time in a long while, Tail felt that the silence of the sky was not empty. It was waiting. Before they called themselves Sarenti, they had many names. Names of regions, of languages, of flags, of sacred rivers, of old borders drawn with a certainty time made ridiculous. Each people had learned to name itself as if that act were enough to separate it from the rest. For centuries, difference had been a source of pride, then suspicion, then defense. Finally, war. Later archives never managed to settle on a single cause. There were disputes over resources, of course. There were technological rivalries, broken treaties, border incidents, campaigns of fear, governments that needed enemies so they would not have to look inward. There were generations taught to believe that security could exist only if the other was weaker. But none of those reasons, isolated, seemed sufficient to explain what came next. The war began as many catastrophes begin, with precise speeches, limited objectives, and the promise that it would soon be over. It did not end. At first, the most powerful nations tried to defeat one another without destroying what they hoped to rule. The first selective extermination weapons left cities standing and killed their inhabitants with an efficiency strategists called clean. The word survived in official documents, although afterward no one could read it without shame. Clean was what did not collapse bridges, did not burn factories, did not contaminate the ports some victor expected to use. Clean was killing without dirtying the infrastructure. Then the war grew. Smaller alliances were absorbed into larger defensive pacts. Neutral nations ceased to exist as a possibility. 3 fronts ended up enclosing almost the entire planet, 3 immense military structures that claimed to fight for survival, justice, or balance, depending on which transmission one listened to. The stories changed flags, but not form. In every territory, people were taught that the others had begun it, that the others would never accept a true peace, that surrender was the same as handing one's children over to extermination. During the first years, there were still negotiations. Then there were only technical pauses. The population descended underground. The shelters had existed before the war, built in times of tension by governments that did not trust their own treaties. They were deep, costly, uncomfortable, intended to house civilians for weeks or months. When the conflict became permanent, they were expanded. New galleries descended beneath the old ones. Schools, hospitals, water depots, cultivation chambers, collective dormitories, birthing rooms, crematoria were excavated. The cities on the surface were left to soldiers, machines, radars, fires, and rain. One generation was born underground. Then another, whose grandparents could no longer describe the sky without relying on inherited images. Children were told about the world as if it were a postponed promise. They were told the seas were larger than any water reservoir, that wind could touch the skin without coming from a duct, that plants grew toward a light that did not hum. They were told about clouds, seasons, animals that did not appear in emergency manuals, open cities where no one had to ask how much oxygen remained. They were told all of it was still there, waiting for them, and that they would see it when they won. The word when sustained millions. In the meantime, every person carried a sphere. They were small, made of transparent resin, scarcely larger than a large seed. Inside were embedded traces of genetic material, enough to identify the bearer if the body could not be recognized. At first, they were issued only to soldiers assigned to the front. Later, when the front stopped being a line and became anywhere the enemy could reach, they were distributed to everyone. Children received theirs in brief ceremonies, at an age when they still did not understand why their parents wept. Some wore it around the neck, others sewed it into their clothing, some held it before sleeping, as if inside that hard drop there were proof that they were still someone. Science also descended into the shelters, although it never stopped looking toward deeper places. 40 years before the conflict, a high-energy laboratory had confirmed something that until then had belonged to theory. They used a super-heavy isotope, stable only under exquisite conditions, cooled until it brushed absolute zero. When they turned it into a quantum condensate, the atoms stopped behaving as individuals and began to respond as a single massive entity, suspended in perfect vacuum by magnetic and optical fields, isolated from vibration by systems that seemed more delicate than music. Then they generated extreme-frequency gravitational waves with modulated plasma collisions. When those waves crossed the condensate, something happened. Energy was absorbed in discrete jumps. Each jump indicated that a particle of gravity had disappeared by exciting an internal vibration of the condensate. The universe had left a measurable trace of its most elusive quanta. They called them gravitons, as the equations already did. In times of peace, the discovery would have opened centuries of patient research. In wartime, it opened a door with soldiers waiting on the other side. For years, physicists resisted the pressure. They argued that detecting a particle did not mean controlling it, that the energy scales were absurd, that gravity, precisely because of its weakness, did not lend itself to rapid engineering. But war had a particular way of answering impossibilities. It increased the budget, shortened the deadlines, and reminded every scientist where their family lived. The first application was crude, ruinously expensive, almost useless. Then it stopped being useless. They discovered that, under conditions of extreme density, certain systems could induce stimulated emission of gravitons. Not scattered radiation, but coherent radiation. An aligned, narrow, directed flow. Someone called it a geyser, by analogy with ancient lasers of light. The name sounded elegant, the device was not. It required enormous energy sources, superconductors subjected to rotating fields, impossible synchronizations, and materials that destroyed themselves after seconds of use. But it worked. The decisive advance was the gravitational phase matrix. A single emitter did not have to produce a devastating force. It was enough to place several devices in precise positions and make their beams intersect at an exact point. Each beam, by itself, passed through matter without visible effect. At the intersection, the amplitudes added together. Local gravity deformed for an instant. An instant was enough. The orbital bombers were born. At first, they were vulnerable. Surface defenses detected them as they entered orbit and shot them down before they could synchronize their matrices. Then they learned to wait farther out, beyond the reach of most weapons, invisible for weeks, entering only to strike. They did not bomb like the old machines. They did not necessarily leave craters. They did not need to pierce rock or melt steel. Gravity did not ask permission of walls. The shelters, designed to withstand explosions, pressure, and heat, discovered that there were ways to die without the ceiling giving way. One type of attack increased effective inertial mass inside an area for barely a second. The bunker remained intact. The water pumps kept working. The lights did not flicker. But hearts could not push blood against that sudden weight, and thousands fell at the same time, with no visible wounds, as if an invisible hand had squeezed life from within. Another type generated two adjacent gravitational foci with a brutal difference between them. Objects positioned between both were stretched by tidal forces. Walls arched, machines split apart, bodies ceased to be bodies. After that, hiding became an old word. No one wanted to continue the war. That was one of the hardest truths for Sarenti historians to accept. There were no crowds celebrating extermination, not permanently. There was fear. There was obedience. There were governments trapped by their own threats. There were military commands convinced that stopping first meant dying first. The war continued not because everyone wanted to win it, but because no one knew how to lose without disappearing. So passed 120 years. Reule was born in a third-level shelter, in an administrative zone of the western front of one of the great alliances. Her parents had also been born underground. As a child, she learned to distinguish shifts by the color of the lamps and seasons, by variations in the rations of mushrooms, algae, and tubers, grown in hydroponic chambers. The first time she heard a recording of rain, she thought it was static in the sound system. At 13, like everyone, she was registered for service. She was not sent to surface installations because she could organize archives, memorize logistics routes, and calculate inventories quickly. That skill saved her life for decades. She worked in underground offices, moving orders, names, figures, ration permits, replacement requests, death certificates. She learned that the administration of an eternal war did not require constant hatred. Forms were enough. She married Reule, a maintenance technician who had seen the sky only once during a military transfer, and spoke of it with an almost religious caution. They had 3 children. The eldest inherited the father's patience. The second asked questions that made instructors uncomfortable. The youngest sang softly inside the ducts because she liked hearing the echo accompany her. All 3 were recruited. So was Reule. By then, going to the front rarely meant fighting with weapons in hand. It meant being sent to special installations, energy plants, assembly complexes, control stations, material excavations, service bases for bombers and orbital defenses. Places that had to be near the surface or directly exposed. Places that attracted attacks the way a lamp attracts insects. Reule died in an electromagnetic conversion plant. The eldest son in an orbital support station. For a time, Reule kept working, not out of strength but out of habit. In the shelters, personal grief had to adapt to collective schedules. Shifts had to be covered, children had to be fed, doors had to be sealed, lists had to be updated. If a mother stopped too long, someone reminded her that everyone had lost someone. On the day the military came to inform her of the deaths of her 2 remaining children, Reule was 55 years old. They used the regulation phrases. They said the children had fulfilled their duty with honor, that their sacrifice brought victory closer, that the nation would remember their names, that she should be proud. Something in Reule broke not with violence, but with clarity. Nation. The word suddenly seemed absurd. None of her children had seen the mountains in the hymns. None had walked the avenues represented in patriotic murals. None had chosen one flag among possible others. They had been born under rock, grown under orders, died in installations whose purpose almost no one understood anymore. They had been told they were defending a homeland that, for them, was a map, a slogan, and a closed door. That afternoon, Reule climbed onto a maintenance platform in the common sector of the shelter. It was not a stage, only a high place, difficult to reach quickly. Below were elders waiting for rations, children in educational shift, technicians, administrators, young soldiers, some officers. Reule had not prepared a speech. Perhaps that was why they listened. She said everyone wanted to live, even those on the other side. She said no alliance was still fighting for victory, but out of fear of being the first to stop. She said perhaps surrender meant death. Yes, perhaps the enemy would not forgive. Perhaps the shelters would be opened and the population exterminated. But she also said they were already dying, that they had spent generations dying slowly in order to sustain the possibility of a life no one ever reached. She did not ask for courage, she asked for exhaustion. She told them it was all right to let go, that it was all right to be the first to lower their weapons, even if that meant saying goodbye, that perhaps others, seeing them do it, would remember that they too were tired, or perhaps not. But continuing only to force other people's children to die as their own had died was not survival. It was a way of obeying death. The children did not understand. The elders did. The young soldiers did too. They brought her down before she finished. She was accused of maximum treason without trial and locked in a transit cell. The next day she was found dead. The official statement spoke of suicide. Decades later, investigations would prove what many had known from the first moment. Reule was murdered while she slept. But the words had already left the shelter. Someone had recorded part of the speech. Someone sent it to another sector. From there it passed to another bunker, then to an internal network, then to military channels, then to clandestine transmissions that crossed whole regions. The image was poor, the sound worse. Reule appeared small, surrounded by pipes and cold lights, her face swollen from crying and her voice broken. It did not matter. In her alliance, the protests began as murmurs, then as isolated refusals, then as administrative mutinies. Logistics personnel delayed orders. Technicians sabotaged transfers. Soldiers of 13, 14, 15 years, too young to remember anything but war and too old to keep believing in it, began to disobey. They had no clear plan. They had an impossible objective: take control and end it one way or another. The story crossed into the other alliances. In one of them, the movement caught with force. In the third, it barely managed to survive. Its commanders acted more quickly. Its networks were more closely watched. Its population more fragmented. Even there, however, in private channels and dormitory whispers, a question began to repeat itself that no government could permit. What if they want to stop too? Reule's alliance fell first. It did not fall to the enemy, but to its own people. The commanders were arrested, communication rooms occupied, arsenals blocked by the very technicians who maintained them. At dawn, a message was sent to the other 2 fronts. It requested an immediate truce to negotiate the end of the war. Both rejected the proposal. Hours later, Reule's alliance transmitted another message, shorter. They surrendered. The news produced bewilderment. No one knew how to answer a total surrender in a war that had forgotten its protocols of peace. The attacks continued. The shelters of the surrendered alliance stopped sending personnel to surface installations. Families gathered underground waiting for the end. Death, even with gravitational weapons, advanced slowly. Bombers had to be positioned, matrices synchronized, targets chosen. That left time for the gesture to be understood. In the second alliance, the protests grew until they occupied entire bunkers. Then its leaders committed the act that finished destroying them. They ordered an attack on one of their own shelters, where the movement's core was concentrated. Beforehand, they withdrew the military contingents under the excuse of a transfer. The rest of the population remained inside. The gravitational strike left almost no visible damage to the structure. It killed everyone. The news leaked within hours. There was no containing it. The message the commanders had wanted to send was received, but not as they expected. If their own leaders could treat their population as the enemy, then the war no longer had sides. That night, most military units refused to obey. Before midnight, the High Command had disappeared from transmissions. At 3 a.m, the Second Alliance announced its surrender. One front remained. For 3 days, the planet waited. The two surrendered alliances had dismantled or lost their intelligence services. They did not know what was happening on the other side. Many thought the Third Front would use the opportunity to destroy them all. Some expected a declaration of victory. Others, in secret, wished to be killed quickly. Waiting was a room without air. On the third day, at 5 p.m, the message arrived. We surrender. There were no conditions. There was no triumph. No army entered enemy capitals. No flags rose over ruins. Only 3 fronts that one after another had stopped sustaining the war. That day would later be called the Triad Surrender. The day no one won, and, for the first time, everyone stopped losing in the same way. The gates of the shelters opened slowly. Some systems failed. In certain places, the surface was poisonous for hours or days. In others, light entered all at once and people screamed because they thought it burned. Millions saw the sun for the first time. Many knelt. Others covered their eyes. Some laughed. Some could not bear it and asked to go back underground. The world was not the promised paradise. There were dead cities, contaminated seas, vitrified regions, magnetic fields altered by old weapons, forests turned to dust, abandoned military machines that continued obeying orders without masters. But there was also wind. There were clouds. There was horizon. Reconstruction was clumsy. They did not know how to govern without enemies. They did not know how to trust assemblies where commands had once stood. They did not know how to argue without hearing. At the bottom of every disagreement, the threat of a new war. So they built a system deliberately uncomfortable for power. 41 administrative regions, none fully sovereign. Local parliaments for nearby matters. A global parliament formed by delegates from all of them for common law. Short mandates, open archives, mandatory historical education. Strict limitations on armed forces, public memory in every city. They also chose a new name, Sarenti, not because they believed a name could clean the past, but because they needed to pronounce something that belonged to no side. They renamed their world as well. The old names remained in archives, museums, songs, and warnings. No one was to forget them, but no one was to live inside them again. For the dead they raised 41 monuments, one at the center of each region. Colossal pillars of concrete and steel, 40 meters to a side and 70 high, covered with transparent resin spheres arranged in a honeycomb pattern. 2,400,000,000 spheres, divided among the regions according to recovered records. When the sun struck the pillars on clear days, they seemed columns of white fire, or liquid crystal, or water burning without being consumed. Up close one noticed a difference. Not all the spheres had the same opacity. Some formed irregular patches, pale wounds on the luminous surface. The official explanation spoke of material variations. The truth was known to everyone. Less than a fifth of the true spheres had been recovered. The rest were replicas. The visible marks belonged to the dead who had returned, at least as proof. The others were represented by imitated absence. The Sarenti learned to live beneath that shadow. They believed, with an almost stubborn faith, that hiding horror invited it to return. Their schools took children to the old shelters. Their museums preserved deactivated weapons, not as trophies but as questions. Their solemn days did not celebrate battles. The Triad Surrender was remembered in silence. The voice of Velia was heard each year, complete, with its poor image and broken sound, without added music, without dramatization. Only a tired woman saying that surrender could also be a way of saving something. Over time, that fear became impetus. If they had once imagined that any outside civilization would be a threat, it was because they had used themselves as the measure. After the war, they decided to do the opposite. Looking at the sky no longer meant preparing for the enemy, but refusing to believe that intelligence must always end in violence. If they found an older species, perhaps they could learn from it. If they found a younger one, perhaps they could warn it. If they found one that was different, simply different, perhaps it would be enough to know that loneliness was not a physical law. Only a few years after the Triad surrender, when cities still lay unreconstructed, and shelters remained full of families afraid to climb to the surface, they launched the first 41 probes. It was a worldwide festival. Not because they had forgotten, but because for the first time they were sending something into the void that was not a weapon, a threat, or a defense. Each region prepared its own silicon disk with maps, languages, images, music, anatomies, records of rain and greetings. The probes departed one by one, separating from the planet like disciplined sparks. Since then, every year, the Sarenti called. They called with radio, with light, with weak gravitational pulses, with probes, with mathematics, with songs, with greetings so simple they resembled heartbeats. They called for almost 3 centuries, and for almost 3 centuries, no one answered. The collector vessel was called Arion 7, although no one at the Institute of Frontier Sciences used its full name. To the operators, it was simply Arion, an automatic capture and transport structure, as long as a small avenue, equipped with braking sails, containment arms, preliminary laboratories, and a navigation core capable of making decisions several light hours from any instruction. It had been designed to recover comet fragments, samples of presolar dust, and metallic remains from old missions, not to collect the first artificial object of unknown origin in Sarenti history. Even so, Arion obeyed. It corrected its trajectory, folded 2 mining modules, and ignited its approach engines with an almost ceremonial delicacy. The calculations indicated that it would reach the object in 49 standard hours. During that time, the Institute stopped sleeping. Tail remained in the analysis hall until exhaustion began to blur the letters. When she agreed to withdraw, she did not go home. She slept 3 hours in a rest room on the lower level, still dressed, her wrist console programmed to wake her at any change. She did not dream of invasions or messages. She dreamed of a smooth surface that reflected nothing. When she woke, the news no longer belonged to the Institute. Someone had leaked the first spectroscopic readings to a public network. Not all the data, but enough. Interstellar trajectory, processed alloys, a size compatible with a personal vehicle, no Sarenti identification. Within minutes, the scientific channels were overwhelmed by journalists, commentators, former contact diplomats, artists, children, alarmists, philosophers, and people with no credential beyond a lifetime of waiting. The object was not a rock. It was a machine. The phrase appeared on millions of screens, repeated in variations that grew less careful each time. Alien machine at the edge of the system. First contact confirmed. Non-Sarenti artifact approaches our world. The more prudent spoke of possible extra-systemic technology. The less prudent were already debating where to build the welcome port. By noon, the plazas were full. Not only in the large cities, also in small settlements, climate stations, agricultural communities, ocean platforms, people came out to look at a sky where nothing could be seen. Some carried pulse lamps and lit them in greeting patterns. Others held the spheres inherited from their families, as if the memory of the dead should witness that moment. In many regions, the monuments were surrounded first by silence and then by songs. The emotion was not uniform. In the public forums, millions demanded an immediate signal toward the entry trajectory. If the object was a probe, they said, perhaps its creators were still listening. Perhaps they were coming behind it. Perhaps the probe was only an advanced scout, an automatic messenger, a hand extended from a civilization capable of crossing distances the Sarenti could barely formulate. Others felt a fear awaken that they had believed abolished. They were not the majority, but neither were they few. They asked why an unknown machine was entering the system now. They asked whether Sarenti transmissions, broadcast for centuries, had revealed too much. They asked whether greetings might be interpreted as coordinates for conquest. Some demanded that the exterior antennas be shut down, that Friendship Day be suspended, that the public routes of the probes be erased, that the planet hide behind silence. The global parliament convened an emergency session, not to decide whether the object existed, but to decide how to behave before the possibility that someone else existed behind it. The old contact protocols, archived for decades as ceremonial documents, were opened and reviewed. Some had been written with an almost childish optimism. Others preserved warnings inherited from a darker age. Do not concentrate leaders in one place. Do not immediately provide complete biological data. Do not allow direct access to planetary navigation systems. Do not answer signals not understood with increasing energy. Sarenti history sat at the table beside Hope. Tale was called to appear by closed link before the Parliament's scientific committee. She stood in the signal hall with the map of the outer edge behind her, and Arion's point slowly approaching the unknown point. "We need a risk assessment," said a representative from the polar region. "We do not have enough data." "Doctor, the public already believes we have visitors on the way." 6 years ago, the public also believed a broken mining sail was singing in prime numbers. There was a brief silence. Someone coughed off camera. "Can you rule out that the object is active?" Tale looked at the readings. Low equilibrium temperature. No detectable emissions of its own. No maneuvering field. No response to passive sweeps. Nothing suggesting course correction. "I cannot rule anything out with absolute certainty," she replied. "But so far it behaves like an inert object." "A dead probe? Perhaps. How long has it been traveling?" Tale did not want to answer yet. There were indications, not conclusions. The surface wear, erosion, accumulation of microscopic impacts, and isotopic signature of the lead suggested an uncomfortable age, but direct measurements were still missing. They still had to touch it. "We will know when Arion has it under containment. People want answers." Tale held the representative's gaze. "Then it would be wise not to give them fantasies dressed as answers." That sentence later circulated, clipped, repeated, admired, and hated with the usual speed of simple things. While the planet argued, Arion reached the object. The transmission was delayed, but everyone in the analysis hall watched it as if it were happening in the present. On the map, the vessel reduced speed until it matched the visitor's trajectory. Then it deployed the observation module. The first image took time to form: patches of noise, automatic corrections, exposure adjustment, particle cleaning. When it appeared, no one spoke. The object was small, irregular, dark. It did not have the elegance of a ship. It had no evident symmetry, no continuous hull, no lights, no surfaces designed to impress. It looked like a relic beaten until it had lost its original intention. An eroded central body supported the remains of antennas, broken rods, warped plates, and a circular structure protected by what was left of a chassis. Some areas were covered in adhered dust. Others showed bare metal, burned by weather longer than any climate. "That cannot be functioning," Irima whispered. Tale did not answer. She magnified the image around one of the fractured antennas. There were welds hardened in strange ways. Metallic pieces joined where they should not touch, as if the vacuum had finished fusing the patience of the materials. On several surfaces were tiny craters, not from one impact, but from countless microscopic strikes accumulated over a duration difficult to imagine. Arion initiated the greeting protocol. First it sent simple pulses: presence, respect, no threat. Then basic mathematical sequences, chemical ratios, physical constants, radio frequency maps, low-resolution encoded images. After that it tried the Sarenti universal languages: patterns of symmetry, hydrogen series, gravitational references, logical structures designed to be recognized by any intelligence capable of building technology. The visitor did not respond. Arion waited the regulation time. It repeated the package. It changed frequencies. It transmitted in light, radio, and weak electromagnetic fields. Nothing. No antenna oriented itself. No circuit woke. No minimal signal indicated that anything inside had heard. Then the vessel touched it, not with pincers at first. A soft containment field surrounded the object, measuring its mass, angular momentum, and structural fragility. Arion adjusted its spin to the visitor's nearly imperceptible rotation. 2 capture arms closed around support points selected by mechanical analysis. A particle of material broke away at the contact and floated for a few seconds before being inhaled by a collector. Tail watched that particle separate and felt an irrational stab of guilt, as if they had hurt a dead person. The first data arrived in bursts: titanium in processed alloy, eroded aluminum, remains of unrecognizable polymer material, traces of gold in a protected area, lead and helium trapped in a sealed compartment, irregular density, accumulated radiation damage, internal components cold, fractured, without electrical activity. No detectable microorganisms, although no one had truly expected otherwise. The preliminary age estimate was not displayed at once on the Institute's public screen. It appeared on a restricted console. Tail read it. Then she read it again. No, someone behind her said. It was not scientific denial. It was a physical reaction. The number had too many zeros. It was not possible to date it exactly from such incomplete data, but all models pointed in the same direction. The object had been traveling far longer than any Sarenti wanted to associate with a living civilization. Not centuries, not thousands of years, not even millions on a comfortable scale. The erosion and isotopes suggested an antiquity older than the current shape of the sky they knew. The committee demanded a press conference. Tail refused. We do not have confirmation. We have an entire planet halted. We have a hypothesis. We have an alien object in a ship coming home. People deserve to know. People deserve that we not confuse fear with information. The argument lasted almost an hour. Tail lost, or accepted losing, because she understood that official silence was already being filled by worse inventions. She appeared before the cameras with a tired face and a laboratory coat she had not had time to change. The global transmission began without music. Tail stood beside an image of the object captured by Arion. For an instant, in millions of homes, plazas, and halted transports, the Sarenti saw the dark visitor floating against a background of stars. I can confirm, she said, that the object under analysis is artificial and does not belong to any known Sarenti technology. The planet held its breath. Its exact origin cannot yet be determined. It entered the system along a trajectory compatible with the orbital plane that, in ancient galactic maps, we associate with progenitor B. That does not imply direct provenance. Interstellar trajectories are altered over prolonged timescales. She paused, aware that the phrase prolonged timescales would not pass unnoticed. An autonomous collector vessel has successfully intercepted it. Before contact, greeting packages were transmitted through multiple communication systems. There was no response. Initial analyses indicate that the object is inactive and in a state of advanced deterioration. Titanium alloys, eroded aluminum, and traces of lead and helium in a sealed compartment have been detected. The vessel will bring the object to the Institute of Frontier Sciences for containment studies. A journalist asked whether it could be a probe sent by a civilization that still existed. Tail chose her words carefully. It is a possibility we cannot evaluate yet. Another asked whether they should expect more objects. We have no evidence of that. Could it be a threat? Tail looked at the image of the visitor. Small, silent, broken. Every unknown object is treated with caution. So far, there is no indication of activity, propulsion, emission, or hostile intention. Doctor, are we alone? The question had no place in a technical conference. Even so, no one interrupted it. Tail took time to answer. Today, we know that someone, somewhere, built a machine and sent it into interstellar space. That is all we know, and it is not little. The sentence became the center of the night. During the weeks Arion took to return, the planet lived in feverish waiting. Schools suspended ordinary programs to speak of contact. Universities organized open debates. The secular temples of memory filled with visitors who left pulse lamps lit beside the monuments. On rooftops, whole families looked toward the evening sky. Reception protocols were prepared as well, in case others came. The probability was minimal, the scientist repeated. But minimal was not zero, and public imagination had already crossed distances no Sarenti ship could travel. What if the object was a beacon? What if it had woken upon entering the system and sent a signal before dying? What if its creators possessed relativistic engines? What if a fleet, alerted by some mechanism the sensors had not detected, suddenly appeared above the planet? The 41 regions enabled welcome zones. They were not military bases. They were open spaces, away from dense cities, prepared with laboratories, translators, medical teams, autonomous generators, and observation chambers. In some, gardens were planted. In others, temporary monuments were installed with the word greeting, written in all regional systems. The gesture moved many and infuriated others. Tale found it beautiful and premature. The fear remained there beneath the joy. There were mass purchases of atmospheric filters, underground capsules, and food reserves. Old shelters were opened by citizens who wanted to check whether they still functioned. In some communities, small groups tried to block radio transmitters. They were detained without violence. In their statements, they almost always repeated the same thing. They did not hate the possible visitors. They simply remembered too well what a frightened civilization could do. Tale understood them more than she wanted to admit. Every night she reviewed Arion's data. Every night the object seemed older. Every night the possibility of a fleet receded a little farther, and with it part of the jubilation. What was coming toward them was not an active emissary. It was not a door opening from the other side. It was something more difficult, mute proof. When Arion finally entered the inner system, millions followed its route live. The vessel slowed near the industrial planet, passed beside one of the distribution bases, and descended toward the Institute before dawn. There was no public celebration at the landing site, only containment teams, scientific representatives, and a security perimeter extended to the cliffs. Tale waited in the reception laboratory. The sealed chamber, almost always empty, was lit with white light. Manipulation arms hung from the ceiling, sensors covered the walls. The ceremonial phrase remained engraved at the back. To receive is also a way of answering. Arion's container entered the transfer tunnel without sound. It coupled to the main chamber, equalized internal pressure, purged particles, opened one seal, then another. The object appeared on a platform suspended by support fields. Up close it was worse, not more threatening, more fragile. The opaque surface flaked away. Some pieces seemed to hold together only by molecular habit. What had looked dark in the images was, in fact, a mixture of blackened metal, embedded dust, and layers eroded to the thinness of old skin. There were no visible inscriptions, no lights, nothing to suggest that the thing had been built to survive so long. Tale approached the containment glass. For an instant she forgot the technicians, the sensors, the internal cameras, and the committee waiting for reports. She thought of those who had assembled it. Unknown hands adjusting parts. A launch room beneath another sun. Someone convinced that a message was worth sending even if they would never know who received it. Density analysis before manipulation, she ordered. Her voice sounded colder than she felt. The technicians activated the scanners. Layers of the object appeared on the screen. Supports, cavities, fractures, fragments of mechanisms, collapsed areas, a partially protected compartment. There was the circular structure observed by Arion, covered by remnants of aluminum almost entirely gone. The chassis around it had yielded in several points, but still preserved the shape of an intention. Irema leaned over the image. It looks like it was protecting something. Tale felt the whole room narrow around that possibility. "Do not touch it yet," she said. "Composition first, then integrity, then partial exposure." The order was registered. The manipulation arms remained motionless. Outside, the planet waited for answers. Inside, under white light and technical silence, the Sarenti looked for the first time at an object made by others. Not by gods, not by monsters, not by invaders, by others. And at the center of that ruin, hidden beneath a shield almost erased by time, there was something round, metallic, and golden that still did not dare to show its face. The scientific committee ordered a second conference before Tale had finished reading the first analyses. It was not a request, nor was it an open imposition. It was one of those decisions wrapped in institutional courtesy that already has the door closed from the inside. The planet was waiting. The 41 regions were demanding information. Public theories multiplied every hour. If the Institute did not speak, others would speak for it. Tale received the instruction in the room adjacent to the reception laboratory, still wearing containment gloves. "We have found a protected internal structure," said the committee director. "That must be communicated. We do not know what it is. We know that it exists. We also know the object is extremely degraded and that any premature conclusion could contaminate public interpretation for generations. The director did not argue that point. He looked as tired as she felt. Then say exactly that. Tail looked through the glass. The visitor rested on the field platform, dark, brittle, almost humble beneath the white light. At the center, the nanometric arms had removed only a narrow strip of covering. Beneath it shone a faint yellow metallic curve, as if something of its creator's sun had survived there out of stubbornness. "Give me 2 hours. You have one." The conference lasted less than 5 minutes. Tail appeared before the global transmission without spectacular images, only a technical diagram of the object on one side and confirmed data on the other. She had learned that, when hope was hungry, any ornament became a promise. Initial containment studies confirm that the artifact is a probe of extra Sarenti origin, she said. No internal activity, signal emission, or functional propulsion systems have been detected. Its material state indicates prolonged exposure to the interstellar medium. She did not yet use the word ancient, not in front of everyone, not without the full margin of error. During structural scanning, we have identified a compartment protected by remnants of aluminum. Inside it is a metallic disc. Because of its location and isolation, we consider it likely that it was designed to preserve information. Its composition, geometry, and surface will be studied over the coming hours. We do not yet know whether the contents, if any exist, can be recovered. The questions arrived like a storm. Was it a map? A weapon? A warning? A message of peace? A biography? A translation system? Could it contain coordinates? Could it contain instructions for building an engine? A cure? A threat? Proof that its creators were still alive? Tail repeated variations of the same answer until her voice began to hurt. We do not know. Not yet. I cannot confirm that. That would be speculation. When it ended, she returned to the laboratory without checking the public reactions. She did not need to see them. She could imagine them. Plazas in silence, households gathered before screens, children asking whether there were voices inside the disk, elders crying before they knew why. She could also imagine those already preparing private shelters or turning off domestic antennas, not from ignorance, but from memory. In the laboratory, the work continued with an almost reverent slowness. The precision arms removed the protective covering millimeter by millimeter. They did not cut, they persuaded. Each separated fragment was stabilized, scanned, and stored. The structure came apart with alarming ease. The exterior aluminum, exposed for longer than all Sarenti civilizations combined, had become porous, brittle, a shadow of metal. Beneath it the disk appeared. It was smaller than many had imagined, a metallic circle attached to its support, covered by an irregular film of dust and fused particles. To the naked eye, under camera magnification, it had a dull golden color. It was not pure gold, they learned that at once. Chemical analyses revealed an extremely thin layer of gold over a copper base. A sensible choice, copper for engraving, gold for protection. A simple, elegant, optimistic solution. They wanted it to last, Irema said. No one answered. Tail requested full spectral scanning, surface tomography, and structural resonance testing. She would allow no direct mechanical contact until she knew whether the disk could survive it. Data began filling the screens. Composition, thickness, deformation, microfractures, contamination by interstellar particles, changes in crystalline structure, radiation damage. Then the dating arrived. The measurement did not depend on a single clue. They used the ratio of lead and helium isotopes trapped in the sealed container. They compared surface erosion with models of interstellar dust flow. They analyzed alterations in crystalline lattices, cosmic ray exposure, micro-impact frequency, entry direction, and galactic dynamics. Each method carried enormous uncertainties. Together, however, they pointed toward the same abyss, 6 billion years. The figure appeared on the main screen as if it did not understand what it meant. For a moment, the room stayed motionless. 6 billion years was not a historical antiquity. It was a cosmological antiquity. When that probe was launched, the current architecture of their sky did not exist. The structures the Sarenti called Progenitor and Progenitor B had not yet finished mingling into the great galaxy they now inhabited. Their sun had not been born. Their planet was not organized dust. There were no Sarenti oceans, no Sarenti wars, no monuments, no tale, no one who could imagine that laboratory. And somewhere that could no longer be reconstructed, someone had built a disk. The third conference was inevitable. This time, Tale did not argue. She appeared before billions of viewers with a still face and eyes too awake. Behind her was displayed a clean image of the disk still suspended in containment. "We have completed the first dating of the artifact," she said. "The results are consistent across several independent methods. We estimate that the probe has traveled for approximately 6 billion years." There was no sound in the transmission, but Tale felt the silence of the planet like atmospheric pressure. "That means we cannot determine its point of origin with precision. Its trajectory was altered by gravitational processes that occurred before and during the merger of the progenitor galaxies. We can state that it entered our system from a direction associated on our maps with the ancient plane of progenitor B, but not that it was born there," she breathed. "I must add something else. Given this timescale, it is extremely unlikely that the civilization that built this probe still exists in a recognizable form. It may have gone extinct, it may have changed beyond any identification. It is possible that no trace of it remains." The questions were fewer than before, perhaps because no one wanted to formulate aloud what everyone had understood. Tale continued. "The disk found inside the compartment appears to have been designed to store information. Judging by its structure, it may be a message addressed to whoever found the probe. The analysis team will now begin atomic resolution surface reading." She did not say what she was thinking, that the disk was a tomb shaped like a greeting. During the hours that followed, the entire institute revolved around a golden surface. They searched for grooves, not with needles, but with beams, fields, and sensors capable of measuring variations smaller than a molecule. If there were engraved patterns, binary modulations, encoded images, pressure waves converted into relief, any intentional mark, they would find it. They prepared models for thousands of possible formats. An alien message did not have to resemble anything Sarenti. It could be inscribed as texture, as chemical changes, as depth irregularities, as crystalline orientation, as radial sequences, as zones of silence. The first sweep found nothing. That alarmed no one. There was surface contamination. They cleaned the reading virtually, not the disk, recalibrated sensors, compensated for deformation, filtered radiation damage, subtracted noise produced by impacts, remade the map, nothing. The second sweep revealed microcraters, abrasion, regions where gold had been stripped away to expose altered copper, zones where even the copper had lost molecular continuity. But no surviving pattern could be separated from chance. Every apparent line proved to be a particle trace. Every repetition came apart when the reading angle changed. Every possible sequence vanished when compared with erosion models. Tale ordered a third sweep, then a fourth. No one protested. The disk had been protected, yes, but not enough for 6 billion years. Nothing conceived by finite hands was meant to last that long in the interstellar ocean. Dust, sparse but fast, had struck the surface for Eris. Cosmic rays had rearranged atoms, broken bonds, introduced defects. Charged particles had polished, burned, erased. The universe had not destroyed the message violently. It had corrected it slowly until it became indistinguishable from itself. By dawn, the team stopped pretending they expected a different result. Irema stepped away from her console and covered her face. Another researcher turned off his screen without closing the report. In a corner, a contact linguist wept with silent rage, as if he had been denied a conversation for which he had prepared his whole life. Tale remained before the atomic map. The disk was smooth. Not perfectly smooth, nothing real was, but smooth of intention, smooth of voice, smooth of recoverable memory. There was thermal noise, random scarring, erosion. There was no message. Or worse, there had been a message. The final report filled hundreds of pages and said, with unbearable precision, that there was nothing left to decipher. The probability of reconstructing original content was indistinguishable from zero. Any attempt at interpretation would produce fiction, not reading. They could study the materials, infer design decisions. Imagine manufacturing technologies, perhaps deduce something about the technical level of its builders. but their voices, images, maps, or greetings had been lost. The final press conference was transmitted at nightfall. Tale asked that there be no moving graphics, no hymns, no regional emblems, only the image of the disk. The object appeared behind her, bright under controlled light, a golden surface polished by time until it seemed newly made. That was the cruelty. What had been erased could look intact. Tale looked into the camera. We have completed the disk reading studies. She did not consult notes. The results indicate that the artifact contained information. Its location, composition, and design leave little doubt. Those who built this probe wanted to send a message. It is likely that they engraved on this disk data about themselves, about their world, perhaps instructions for understanding them or for answering. We cannot know. She paused. This time she did not try to hide her exhaustion. The surface has been eroded for approximately 6 billion years by interstellar dust, radiation, and high-energy particles. Any original pattern has been lost. No recoverable structure remains. There are no grooves, modulations, or intentional marks that we can distinguish from noise. We cannot decipher it. We never will. The planet listened. Tale turned her face slightly toward the image of the disk. There was someone, she said. A civilization that looked at the sky and felt in some way what we have felt. They built a machine, prepared a message, and launched it into space in the hope that someone, someday, would find it. Her eyes returned to the camera. We found it. No one in the room moved. But the universe is large and time is long. They sent us a letter. Distance erased the ink. The transmission did not end immediately. For several seconds, the image held still. Tale, the disk, the white light. Then the signal passed into silence. That night there was no celebration. In the cities, the pulse lamps were lit anyway, but more slowly. In the plazas, people gathered around the monuments of memory without knowing whether they were grieving their own dead or unknown ones. The pillars covered with spheres burned under the night, lighting like columns of ice. The marks of different opacity, the real spheres among the replicas, seemed more visible than on other days. In many homes, children asked what the disk said. Adults answered in different ways. Some said no one knew. Others said perhaps it said hello. Others that perhaps it said we are not alone. Others could not speak. At the Institute of Frontier Sciences, Tale returned to the terrace before dawn. The ocean was dark. Above the horizon shone the stars of the ancient stream of Progeniturb. Young lights crossing an old, mingled galaxy, full of remnants that attracted one another and forgot one another. The Sarenti antennas were still transmitting. Out there traveled their own probes. Silicon disks, maps, images, laughter, rain, music, greetings carefully engraved, every year 41 more, each one imagined as a bottle thrown into the sea. For generations they had believed the gesture was enough to defeat solitude. Now they knew that the sea did not only separate, it also erased. Tale thought of the hands that had made the golden disk. She did not know how many fingers they had, under what gravity they had walked, what name they gave their star, whether they had known wars, whether they died afraid, whether they expanded until they became unrecognizable. She did not know whether the probe had left a blue planet, a red one, a dark one, an oceanic one, a frozen one, or a moon under an impossible sky. She did not know whether its builders had resembled the Sarenti in anything, but they had done one thing the Sarenti understood. They had called, and that call, though erased, had arrived. With dawn, light touched the distant monument across the bay. The spheres caught the sun and multiplied it into white fire. Tale watched the irregular stains of the real spheres, those barely visible wounds in the luminous column. Less than a fifth had been recovered. The rest were replicas, attempts to give shape to an absence. The golden disk was the same, she thought, an absence with an edge. During the days that followed, the global parliament debated whether to continue sending probes. The proposal to suspend them did not win a majority, but it existed. For the first time in centuries, the question was not whether there was someone out there, but whether calling made sense when time could turn every voice into a mute surface. The debate lasted weeks. In the end, Friendship Day was not cancelled. That winter, the 41 regions launched their probes as always. But the silicon disks included something new. The image of the artifact they had found, the composition of the golden disk, the estimate of its 6 billion-year journey, and an explanation of what they could not recover. They also included a sentence agreed upon by the global parliament after endless discussion. We do not know what they meant to say, but we know they meant to speak. The probes departed one by one toward different directions. From the plazas, the Sarenti lit their pulse lamps. Light, silence, a greeting reduced to its skeleton. Tail watched the launch from the institute surrounded by her team. No one applauded at first. Then a child in some plaza shown on the screen lifted her lamp and began to laugh. Others imitated her. It was not exactly jubilation. It was something more fragile and therefore more serious. The Sarenti had received an answer. Not the one they expected. Not a voice. Not a map. Not a fleet descending among the stars. Not an ancient wisdom capable of embracing them from the far side of time. Only a mute object, an empty disk, proof of an intention ravaged by eras. They had company, but in an infinite graveyard, and still they kept calling.